record. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our public forum this evening. Tonight's presentation is on local Indian boarding schools, the process of cultural and family rupture and the effects on local tribes. It's sure to be informative and meaningful for us. And a few reminders before we start. We're going to ask that you stay on mute because there's dogs and family members and TVs in the background. And using speaker view can help focus on the presentation. We're going to have a Q&A period, so please put questions in the chat box. Our moderator is going to read them out loud. This presentation is being recorded for later viewing on our YouTube channel and will be linked on our Facebook page. The presentation and the Q&A will last about an hour. And after that time, we're asking all members to stay for a brief member meeting. An agenda was sent to everyone on Monday. We're going to have a post-election wrap-up, some info on upcoming events and some new projects, and a time for member comment and discussion. So for those of you unfamiliar with the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. The League encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Further, the League of Women Voters Northern Lower Michigan and acknowledges the land we serve as a traditional territory taken from the Anishinaabe tribal nations and honor their roles today in taking care of this land. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. November is nationally recognized as Native American Heritage Month, a time for our nation to celebrate and learn about Indigenous people and cultures and their accomplishments. We're so pleased to have Eric Hemenway with us this evening. Most of you know Eric. His vast knowledge and his sharing his personal stories and experiences really help us to gain a truer awareness and connection with our tribal community members. Eric is an Anishinaabe Odawa from Cross Village, Michigan. His mother is a tribal citizen, Peggy Hemenway. Eric is the Director of Repatriation, Archives, and Records for the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. Eric oversees the management, collecting, and preservation of historic documents and materials for the tribe. These materials are used to support government functions, its citizens, educational initiatives such as museum exhibits, media, curriculum, publications, historical interpretation, and presentation. Collaborations on exhibits have included the National Park Service, the State of Michigan, Mackinac State Historic Parks, Emmett County, the Welt Museum in Vienna, Austria, and the Harbor Springs History Museum, as well as other museums. Educational partnerships include Harbor Springs Public Schools, University of Michigan, Michigan State University, Harvard, Yale, and Aquinas College. Eric has also extensive work experience under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. He currently sits on the boards for the Michigan Historical Commission, CMU Clark Library, and Little Traverse Conservancy. Eric is a former board member of the Michigan Humanities Council, Michigan Historical Society, Emmett County Historical Commission, National American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act Review Committee, Harbor Springs Historical Museum, and the Michigan Commission on the commemoration of the bicentennial of the War of 1812. That's a mouthful. He's a busy guy. And so we're very, very pleased that Eric is joining us this evening. So I'll turn this over to Eric. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. No, I'm really happy to be here tonight to share some more local history, local story of something that really broke into national and international news last year, and that's Indian boarding schools. But this story has been with Native communities since day one of their inception. And so now more people are starting to listen to what the story is and Full disclosure, I never went to an Indian boarding school. I went to a one-room schoolhouse in Cross Village, and I'm not that old, but we just had a school that late. And so from there, I went to Harbor Springs Public School where I graduated. So I don't speak from firsthand experience, and that's important for me to put out there right away, because as we get more into the story, there are a lot of people who have that experience. And I always defer to them. If you want to know what happened at the schools, I'll talk to the survivors. They're coming forward. But I see my place in this as giving some historical context. I want to know what created the system, what created the building, and what, put this in place. So that's a lot of where my angle is in for telling this story. So in putting this together, I kept going back, and what created the mindset, the ideology, the policy, the law, what created an institution to separate families and to change people. And I had kept going further back, decade by decade, century by century, until really it came to contact with Europeans and native people of this continent. And the first people, the Dutch, the French, the British, the Spanish, which will later accumulate into the United States, they all had this idea that the first people here were savages. And they weren't civilized by their standards as Europeans and Americans. And since they were savage, it was literally the God-given duty of these European and American people, governments, and really people of influence to come and civilize native people. So the idea of civilizing native people began with day one. That when the Dutch, the British, and every other European came here, they said, well, we need to civilize all these savages. And so they started to create laws and policies, and also society as a whole saw the need to civilize tribal communities. It wasn't a one-off church, denomination, or politician. This was a group effort by everybody, and that was coming here to quote unquote civilize quote unquote the savages. And Christian denominations were equally invested in the civilization process. In the 16, 17, 18, and even 1900s, the matrix was, in order to be civilized, you had to be Christian. You couldn't be non-Christian and be civilized. It was just unfathomable. So churches had this equal vested interest in carrying out this work. And the churches would often, work with government agents. They would help craft and influence laws and policies. So there was a lot of moving parts in this work to quote unquote civilize native people. And upon immediate contact with tribes, Europeans and Americans sought to change tribal populations as much as possible under their argument. It was their God-given right to do so. This idea called manifest destiny, right to discovery. These all feed into this idea of divine intervention when it came to Europeans, Americans, and tribal people. It's kind of hard to fathom nowadays in the 21st century, but this isn't hiding in any records. This is in very plain sight of how people were interacting with Native people. And I like quotes. Quite a bit, because then you can see the mindset of people from the time period. And I often say, don't take my word for it. Listen to the people who were there on the ground living at this time. And this is from 1622 in Virginia. So this is literally, ground zero for contact. And this is what they have to say. Because our hands, which were tied with the gentleness and fair usage, are now set at liberty by the treacherous violence of the savages, not untying the knot, but cutting it, so that we who have had possession of no more ground in their waist and are purchased at a valuable consideration to their own contentment gain, may now by a right aware and law of nations invade the country and destroy them who sought to destroy us. So this is this idea of going forward and doing whatever needs to get done, invade the country and destroy them who sought to destroy us. And as a Native person, as I read this, I see the spin that's going on. That, the tribes are savages, they're the aggressors. Also neglecting the fact that European populations came here uninvited, and they're the invaders. They're coming into these native spaces and claiming the lands as their own, and oftentimes being met with resistance. So, but it's a spin. So I work a lot with high schools and sometimes fifth grade classes, and we look at these primary sources and who's telling the story, and also what is the angle of this? Because there's certainly an angle with this, coming out of Virginia in 1622. And again, they don't say Native people. They don't say Odawa, Cherokee, Potawatomi, Seminole. They're not naming nations for sure. It's the violence of the savages. So we fast forward 200 years on this continent, and the view of natives as savages would persist. And this is from Reverend James Silkrieg's report in 1861. And this is through the Episcopal Church in Michigan. It is not a vain effort to preach the gospel to men as low and degraded as the savages of our American forest. It is better, in reference to the subject, to believe and firmly trust in the word of God than to put confidence in promises. So again, this is literally 200 years later, and this term savage is being used by a church official. And in my mind, this term savage is equivalent to the N-word. It's very derogatory. It's used in this space to show that these people aren't equals, that they're a savage, and savages can't own land. They don't have any rights. And they're literally one step away from the beasts of the forest, as some would say. And so what do you do with beasts of the forest? You hunt them down, and you come in and you start to utilize the land in a quote unquote civilized manner. And I know you can't read this, but this is the Declaration of Independence. This is the document for this country. When things get rough, we point to the Declaration of Independence. That this is the wisdom of quote unquote the founding fathers that they put in place for future generations, along with the Bill of Rights. This is to steady the ship when the seas get stormy, and this is what set policy and dictated action for generations to the present day. You can't say enough about the Declaration of Independence for some, but for Native people, where are we in this document? We're listed twice within the Declaration of Independence. Once in terms of commerce and trade, and the second time in the grievances against King George. And this is what they say about Native people. He, the king, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare it is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So this is in the Declaration of Independence. This is how the founding fathers are labeling my ancestors and the ancestors of other Native people. And this pulls no punches. It's very blunt. Merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This gives the green light to go out and do what needs to get done, whether it's violence against men, women, and children, taking land, so on and so forth. People point to this. And so the term savage is used in the highest order in terms of documentation in the United States. They don't even say tribal nations. They say Indian, but it's an Indian savage. And so you'll see nowadays, a lot of Native people are starting to flip this, and they have t-shirts that say merciless Indian savage. And what they're referring to is the Declaration of Independence. I have one of these t-shirts, of course, and I wore it out in the public, and people didn't like it. They felt very uncomfortable around it. And I said, well, you may feel uncomfortable reading it, but how would you feel if this is the repercussions of this terminology for the last 250 years? So again, perspective. In July 4th, 1779, during the Revolutionary War, this is American soldiers, after destroying Iroquois villages, primarily in New York, civilization or death to all American savages. And this would be well known in New York, where the Haudenosaunee, also known as the League of Iroquois, were fighting in this war, some for the Americans, some for the British. And this was under George Washington. General George Washington needs no introduction in American history in place, but he was also known as the town destroyer by the Iroquois because of what he did to over 40 different Iroquois villages during the Revolutionary War. He would go through and destroy the villages, but not only destroy the villages, he would destroy all the food caches. So when people came back to their villages, they had no food and they would starve out. And this is one of the war cries from his soldiers: civilization or death to all American savages, not one or the other, but all Native people. And so I'm really pushing on these quote unquote founding fathers, because we look to them as just that, the founding fathers of this country. But what does that mean for Native people? Hunter or savage state requires a great extent of territory to sustain it, that it's compatible with the progress and just claims of civilized life. It must yield to it. Nothing is more certain than if the Indian tribes do not abandon that state and become civilized, they will decline and become extinct. The hunter state, though maintained by warlike spirits, presents but a feeble resistance to the more dense, compact, and powerful population of civilized man. James Monroe, writing to Andrew Jackson. So this idea that you have to become civilized or become extinct would persist throughout the record, throughout society, throughout policy for the next 200 years. And Native people would become known as the vanishing race by the late 19th century. And there's some truth to that. By the turn of the 20th century, Native people represented 0.5% of the population in the United States. Today, we're about 1.5%. We're climbing in the right direction, but early 20th century, very, very low numbers across this country for Native populations. So it wasn't just one or two groups deciding that Native people needed to be civilized. It was everybody who was not Native said these people need to change. And they started to create what they called civilization policies. And after the War of 1812, which the Odawa from this area fought in against the Americans to protect their rights and their lands, things would change very drastically for tribes. And the Great Lakes tribes had to come with terms with the United States, forcing these policies upon them. As the United States grew larger and more powerful, they were able to dictate these policies onto tribes. And they did this on every level of tribal life, whether it was government, appearance, religion, education, family structure, use of land, everything was subject to change under these civilization policies. There's also part of the treaty process, as tribes had to enter into these negotiations, often to keep their lands and avoid removal, which many did not avoid. This process of civilization was written into these treaties. So they would provide for schools and teachers, all under the guise that you had to change. And a big figure that is part of these civilization policies is Thomas McKinney, who was the superintendent of Indian trade. He thought that the best way to civilize Native people was to create this factory system, agriculture, manufacture, trade, as a civilization tool. McKinney fought for a national Indian school system that would be supported by his factory system. His bill failed, but what did happen out of all of this work was the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. So when you start seeing the federal government put federal dollars into the federal budget, you know things are serious. And we start to see this paper trail of line items in the budget for the next 100 years of the Civilization Fund Act. They're actually putting money in the federal government coffers to go out and support schools, teachers, so on and so forth. But this is all under the guise of changing people from quote unquote a savage state into a civilized one. And this is Amos Bruce. He's the superintendent of the Iowa agency, the Indian agency, but they wouldn't easily be assimilated. This is in 1842, the Commission of Indian Affairs annual report. The operations of the missionaries among the Indians of this agency, I regret to say, have been attended with but little success. It would seem next to impossible to persuade savages to abandon their superstitions and conform themselves to the customs and habits of civilized life. So as a Native person reading this, I'm grateful that they were stubborn because they passed on culture, language, and traditions to the current generations. They didn't abandon quote unquote their superstitions, AKA traditional beliefs, AKA heritage, AKA culture. So it's all how you see this and how you view this primary source. But the people weren't changing very easily. It wasn't just the church and the government who saw Native people as savages, it was society. And this is from 1874. Kit Carson, very famous frontiersman, often seen as a hero in early American history. And the fighting trapper, Kit Carson to the rescue. And in this novel cover, you can see that Kit is killing a native and one in each hand, and perpetuating the idea that natives are savages, bloodthirsty, violent. This has been going on for 2 centuries by this point. So this is the type of things that kids are reading. This is what's being passed around in young social circles. That these native people, if they don't conform, then what's the alternative? Extinction. So we've seen this in the words of the government and earlier phrases. Now we're seeing this played out with the greater population at this time period. So Indian education. This is certainly one of the pillars of the civilization process, that Native children need to be taught in a Western manner. But Western education with Native children began with contact. That as soon as Europeans started to arrive to these shores, they built churches, and then they built mission schools adjacent to these churches. These went all along up and down the East Coast, and they started, whenever a church was built here in the Great Lakes, it was often accompanied with these small mission schools. And missions, these go back to the 1600s. And Michigan had numerous mission schools in the 1800s. They were operated by various Christian denominations, but primarily they were Catholic. And mission schools were not federal boarding schools. The local tribe would often work with the mission schools, but it was by their design, and it was voluntary. And the school here that was in Harbor Springs, the Holy Childhood, started as a mission school in 1829. And it'll later become a federal boarding school in 1886. But for that time period between 29 and 86, this was a mission school. It was built by the Odawa. They helped fund it with food and clothing and fuel for firewood. And the numbers were relatively small. Maybe 10 to 20 kids would be at this school. Again, it was at the discretion of families who wanted their kids to be here. They weren't forced to send their kids there. So just fun fact, when you see these signs or any type of markings around Harbor Springs, it says 1829. That's when it started with these Odawas who were there. Settlers didn't really arrive into this area by the 1870s. So in 1829, this was all Odawa. And there was also government Indian schools were in operation, but they were very small in number, and they were day schools. And these kids would go there for the day and they would go home. We had some of these schools up by Bay Mills. There was one in Middle Village, AKA Goodhart, up until the 1880s, but they went home at the end of the day. But these government schools were the prelude to the federal Indian boarding schools. So this is one of the earliest images of Holy Childhood. It was late 1870s, early 1880s, not quite sure when. And you can see that's the church. It's changed drastically since then. And that's the old mission school right next to it. And a very simple structure, more like a one-room schoolhouse. And like I said, it was funded primarily by the Odawa, who were there to help support it. But by the late 1880s, the United States was looking over its efforts to civilize all the Native people, and it deemed that it was failing, that they needed to do more to civilize the Native people. They were still speaking their language, practicing their customs, still carrying on the old ways, the savage ways, the pagan ways, the heathen ways. So they decided to ramp up their efforts in order to change people. And this is from Hiram Price, the Commission of Indian Affairs. It doesn't get any higher up the food chain in terms of policymakers than the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And this is what he had to say in his annual report of 1881. It is claimed and admitted by all that the great object of the government is to civilize the Indians and render them such assistance in kind and degree that will make them self-supporting. And yet, I think no one will deny that one part of our policy is calculated to produce the very opposite result. It must be apparent to the most casual observer that the system of gathering the Indians in bands or tribes on reservations and carrying to them victual and clothes, thus relieving them the necessity of labor, never will and never can civilize them. Labor is an essential element in producing civilization. If whites were treated as we treat the Indians, the result would certainly be a race of worthless vagabonds. The greatest kindness the government can bestow upon the Indians is to teach him to labor for his own support, thus developing his true manhood, and as a consequence, making him self-reliant and self-supporting. So see a lot in this as a Native person, that Native people have always been pretty hard workers. I mean, we had to work really, really hard to survive in a pretty hostile environment of the Great Lakes for thousands of years. So it wasn't like we didn't know labor and we knew manhood. And we were always self-supporting and self-reliant. We've been living here for 10,000 years. So how can you not survive in this environment without being self-reliant and self-supporting? So I say this kind of with tongue in cheek, but it's just almost the audacity, that somebody will look at, these populations and say that they don't have any work ethic and they don't know how to support themselves. But that's the mindset. And then this really paternal idea that we have to come in and guide you by the hand and teach you, how to be self-reliant. But this also begins with education. And you have to look at, how these kids are learning. So by the 1880s, a decision was made to create and fund federal Indian boarding schools across the country. The groundwork for these schools had been laid in the previous centuries. That's why I wanted to show the historical context for this. These schools didn't just spring up out of nowhere. This idea of civilizing people had been in place for centuries, literally. And there would be I got to correct this, there would be over 400 of these schools in the United States at the height of the boarding school era between 1886 and 1940, over 400. Some schools were operated by the federal government, but many were run by Christian churches that received federal funds. Most of these that were run by the church were run by the Catholic Church. The first and largest school was a Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879 to 1918. It was founded by Richard Pratt, a U.S. Army man, and thousands of Native children from across the country attended Carlisle, including Anishinaabe from Michigan. So Carlisle was the biggest, largest, most well-funded, but you see, it didn't really run that long. And by the 1920s and 30s, the United States was looking at this program of Indian boarding schools and seeing that it wasn't working. But many schools would keep going on well into the 20th century. So my focus is the Odawa of Little Traverse. And these are some of the schools that I've found that Little Traverse Odawa students attended. This list will grow as we do more research, but we know that they went to one of five, or there was 5 boarding schools within Michigan. Up by Baraga, Holy Name of Jesus, Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School, Harbor Springs, the Mount Pleasant Industrial School, Mount Pleasant, St. Joseph's School down in by Kalamazoo, and there was one on Mackinac Island. But from my research, these are the schools we know that Odawa children from northern Michigan went to: Holy Childhood, Carlisle, Mount Pleasant, Toma, Wisconsin, Haskell, Kansas, Genoa, Nebraska, and Chilocco in Oklahoma. So they weren't just going to schools within the state, they were sending kids out of state to these various schools. And I still haven't figured out the rhyme or reason why they would go to some schools and not others. Sometimes kids would go to a school for 1 or 2 years and transfer to another. Sometimes they would stay at the one school their entire academic career, and some kids didn't go to the schools at all. So there's a lot of moving parts into how kids got to these schools. So I worked with the University of Michigan for the last couple of years, and our project started out with literacy of Native students in the early 20th century, and it very quickly got into boarding schools because we were looking at where the kids were going. All the kids are at boarding schools. So we wanted to show, just the numbers and where these are Little Traverse Odawa students, and they're at the 3 main schools for us: Carlisle, Mount Pleasant, Holy Childhood. And this is the average of attendance for these kids at these schools from 1889 to 1931. Pretty low numbers for Carlisle, but that's still representing, a decent number. But then Holy Childhood has very steady numbers throughout this time period, almost, over 200 at one point. And then Mount Pleasant as well. We had a large number of kids attend the Mount Pleasant Industrial School. My great-grandfather went to the Mount Pleasant School, and you can see, but Holy Childhood has the bulk of Odawa students from northern Michigan. Then we looked at the local scene, and we picked the 2 largest high schools from Emmett County during the time period, Harbor Springs and Petoskey. And we looked at all the graduating classes through this time period and the average number you can see, and then the Odawa. And I based, the Odawa primarily on family name. Now, I probably made some mistakes in this, as all data has mistakes, but even though we could maybe account for 2 or 3 slipping past me, the numbers were really, really low, often 0, 1, who are graduating from Harbor Springs and Petoskey during the same time period. Petoskey has some really high numbers, 70, 80, 90, but during that same time period, virtually no Odawa are graduating. But we, flip back to this graph that shows everybody is going to the boarding schools, Harbor Springs and Mount Pleasant. So given a population roughly of 3,000 to 4,000 Odawa at these time periods, and you have 300 of your kids, that's pretty much everybody. All your kids are going to these schools, these boarding schools. And some kids were day students and some kids were boarders. They lived at the schools. Not every kid was a boarder, not every kid was a day student. And one of my colleagues at University of Michigan was really taken at the correlation between attendance and enrollment. Sometimes the enrollment's a lot higher than the actual attendance, but at Holy Childhood, it was really, really similar. And so those who enrolled often attended. And again, these numbers, 100, 150, 200, that's all the kids. And a lot of these kids were also from the Grand Traverse area, from Leelanau, Antrim, Grand Traverse. So a lot of those kids were coming up to Holy Childhood as well. So this is probably one of the more infamous images of the boarding schools. And this is Carlisle, early 1900s. And there are kids from all over the country in this photo: Alaska, California, North South Dakota, Florida, New York. And there are Anishinaabe from Michigan in this photo. I just haven't identified them yet. We have the records of Carlisle, and there are, a dozen, maybe 20 so Native or Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi children from Michigan at Carlisle during this time period. But once kids arrive to these schools, they are often put into uniforms, have their head shaved, hair cut, and tried to assimilate into this, monolithic look. And as soon as they arrived at these schools, any type of cultural items were taken, any type of cultural dress, and they were given these uniforms. So somewhere in this photo, there are Odawa from Northern Michigan. And this photo just was really took me. She's a very striking young girl. Her look, her dress, everything about her. She's from the plains. She's a Lakota. And this is the day of her arrival to the Carlisle school. And I believe her grandfather was Sitting Bull, very powerful Lakota chief, having his granddaughter attend Carlisle. And this is 1 year later. And she is in the back left standing. So very stark transformation appearance wise. And that was by design. When kids arrived to these schools, they didn't want them wearing their traditional garb, traditional hair, and they were immediately physically changed with the dress and the hair. And this was part of the system of assimilation. These were institutions of forced assimilation. So appearance was the first thing, and then language. It was forbidden to speak your language at these schools. So if you were caught speaking your language, there was punishments, and punishments ranged from beatings, isolation, starvation, revoked family visits, and so on and so forth. And some of these kids, were as young as 4 or 5 years old going to these schools. So it was very instinctual to speak your language, your first language, but that was quickly taken out of them through punishments. And this is Susie. She's Odawa, and she's from Bay Shore. And this is her, I guess you would say, her class photo from Carlisle. So this is a local connection. This isn't just Lakotas and other people going down to Carlisle. This is Susie. And Susie has, ties to, like I said, Bay Shore, Charlevoix area. And she was there for about 2 years. This is Isaac. And Isaac was at Carlisle. He's from Charlevoix, and he went into the service like many, mainly men during this time period, but some very few women. But a lot of guys went into the service upon completion of attendance of the boarding schools. Then we get into Mount Pleasant, the Mount Pleasant Industrial School from 1893 to 1934. This was a very large school in Michigan. Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi children from all over the state attended this school. It was a government-run school, wasn't run by any churches, but still religion was a big element of the education there. You had to go to church every Sunday. That was mandatory. There was no getting out of it. And they actually had church for the Protestants and the Catholics. So they separated them and took them to their respective churches. And while at this school, this labor intensive, they weren't teaching kids to become the next lawyer, teacher, physician, doctor. They were teaching them the basics, but then there was this very large emphasis on work, that these kids were going into the workforce when they were done with the school. Laborers, carpenters, maids, seamstress, whatever the labor was of that day. That was the focus. And these kids worked very hard at these schools, especially here at Mount Pleasant. They were doing farming, they were doing carpentry, and a lot of times they were working to help support the school. And these kids, regardless of age, were expected to work. And the day began between 5 and 6 a.m. and they would go through their chores, their classes. They had a big emphasis on physical education, keeping in shape, and their day would end 7 or 8. So very full day, very hard day. And again, regardless of age, and you can see that they're put in uniforms and had this very strict look. Sports were a big part of many of the boarding schools, not all of them, but many of them had sports programs for their students. And this is at Mount Pleasant. And baseball, football, track, basketball was part of some of the curriculum, so part of the activities for the schools, but not everybody. So there was some friendships that were certainly created at these schools. And from what I've learned, that not every student had a bad experience. That some students who attended these schools had good experiences. They were fed, they learned, they had good friendships, they weren't treated poorly. But at the same time, you hear stories of students who were absolutely brutalized at these schools at the same time period, at the same school. And some kids never made it out of the schools. They passed away at the schools. So the individual experiences vary from individual to individual. But sports were a part of it. And I was given this talk recently, and somebody mentioned Jim Thorpe. He was a Sauk native who went to Carlisle, and he went beyond everybody in terms of athletics. The Carlisle football team actually beat professional teams, and Jim went on to win gold medals in the Olympics. So Jim was the 1%er of the 1%ers. Yes, he excelled at athletics, but at the same time, he was at an institution that forbid him to speak his language, punish kids for practicing their traditions and their culture. So yes, he did well, but he was still, in this system of forced assimilation and punishment. And sometimes kids push back. And this girl, 16-year-old girl, wasn't having it, and she tried to burn the school down. So I've seen this article in different newspapers, and I think the girl tried twice. So I don't think this was a simple act of rebellion. Things were happening at these schools, and she wanted the schools gone. So this girl confessed to it. And she looks like she tried to set the dormitory on fire. Don't know this girl's name or her whole story, but there is a story behind this without a doubt. And then something I see quite often in the newspapers is runaways. This happened all the time, no matter what school. The kids wanted to just go back home. And this one little red runaway, 8 years old. This is what, second, third grade? 8-year-old boy is at Mount Pleasant, and he tries to walk back home to Harbor Springs in November, mind you. So this time of year, and we're starting to finally get some November weather now. And if you can imagine, you're an 8-year-old boy, probably just with a basic pair of leather shoes and a wool coat, and he's trying to walk the 180 miles or so back home to Harbor Springs. That's what he's trying to do. So again, there's a story behind this. So it drive this young boy to walk for days in the dark by himself to get back home. Yes, he wanted to be with his family, but something else was going on. Maybe he was being treated poorly, being punished. But the fact that this very young boy would do this speaks volumes. And then the title is just indicative of the day. These racist titles, Little Red Runaway. The last I checked, no Native people are really red. There are a lot of different shades of tan and brown, but we're not really red. Now we get local. This is Holy Childhood of Jesus Indian Boarding School, operated from 1886 till 1983. This is one of the last Indian boarding schools to close its doors in the country. Most schools were closing by the 20s and 30s, but Holy Childhood kept going on up until 1983. This is mind-boggling to me in doing this research. This is a photo, I believe, from 1890 in front of the church. And I have a difficult time now looking at this after hearing stories of what happened at Holy Childhood. And you can see these kids are very young. And from the records that I've seen about Holy Childhood, the youngest kids that went there were 4 years old. And some of these kids would stay for a year or two, and some would stay for 10. And they would literally live at the schools. Most of the time, they went home during the summer, but sometimes they stayed through the summer. So it wasn't always a given you would go back home. And these kids in this photo, their body language speaks volumes. Heads down, very dejected in some instances. And the girls are on the right with their heads shaved, and the boys are on their left. And none of them, these young kids aren't looking up. So that, usually when kids are getting their picture taken, we all know, big cheesy smiles, lots of goofing around, it's a big event, but not for these kids. They're not looking up, they're not smiling, they're shying away. They're actually trying to make themselves smaller in this photo in some regards by leaning away from the camera. And so this is downtown Harbor Springs. And also during this time period, this dichotomy that's occurring in northern Michigan in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, where there's these pageants, these plays that were being put on locally to draw tourists in, and they were wildly successful, very successful, that thousands of tourists would come to these plays and pageants in Harbor Springs and Petoskey throughout the summer. Huge draw. And so a lot of these kids from the boarding schools would actually have to go and be in these plays and pageants because they were money makers. And so they would dress these Native kids up to be in these pageants and plays. So for the play, you go be Native, go be Indian, but then when the play was over, stop being Indian and go back to school. And in this photo, this is a young kid, maybe 5, 6 years old, maybe 4. And she's part of these plays. And they, keep these costumes just for the summer. And then when necessary, they would dress up and play Indian. But then when the day was over, you had to stop being Indian. And so a lot of mixed messages being sent to these kids during this time period. Again, these stories of runaways. This is from 1940. And 2 young boys, not too young, 13, young teens, they want to go back home. And they're trying to get back home to up in Ishpeming, up in the Upper Peninsula, or Munising, I'm sorry, not Ishpeming, Munising. And this is February 1940. And you can just imagine the winters back then. And these 2 young guys decide that they're gonna go for it. They want to go home. And this is before the bridge is built. So they'd have to cross the ice at the Straits of Mackinac. And they run away. And they get to one of the aunties' houses, one of the boys' aunties' houses in Cross Village. And the auntie says, you have to go back. You're not going to make it. You need to go back to school. So they stay the night at the auntie's house. And then the next morning they venture out and they make it to a place called Sturgeon Bay. And one of them freezes to death. And the other boy has to go back. He's severely frostbitten, but he makes it back and says, this is what happened. So these stories of runaways are over and over and over. And these kids are risking their lives. What compels these young people to, walk over 100 miles in these conditions. Something very drastic is occurring. This isn't simply homesickness. There's something going on that's pushing them to risk their lives to go back home. This is another photo of Holy Childhood right in front of the church. Just in the very front, you can see the age, these young kids, and figuring, the stories are coming out of how these kids ended up at these schools. And I found a brochure from one of the railways, from the 1880s, and they're promoting the railways heavily for tourism. They want to, get people on the trains and get them up north, and get out of the cities, get out of the grime and the dirty air. Come, inhale clean air and drink clean water. That was their seller. And so they had these brochures of tourist destinations when you arrived at Harbor Springs, and Weekwetonson, Harbor Point, Holy Child Church. And then they also had as a tourist destination, the Indian boarding school, one of the largest Indian boarding schools in the country, they dubbed it. And in this brochure that was being put out by the train companies, it said, all of these Indian kids go to this school because they're not welcomed at the public schools. So that, a piece to the puzzle for myself. How did these kids end up here? They weren't welcome at the public schools. They just simply were segregated out. They just weren't being allowed. And if you weren't going to school, then social services would come in and scoop you up and put you in the school, or put you in foster care, and then you go to the school anyway. So again, a lot of moving parts on how these kids got there, but that was a real big piece of evidence for me, just seeing that right in plain sight, that said the kids just simply aren't welcomed at the public schools. So this is the complex at its height, early 1900s, and the church is where it is today. Still looks the same, but the big building in the middle was a red brick building. It stood until 2007. That was the school itself. And on the right was the dormitories for the nuns, the Sisters of Notre Dame. And on the left was for the Franciscans, who were the priests. So the Franciscans and the Sisters of Notre Dame ran the school in its entirety from 1886 to 1983. So a lot of continuity there. And that's the school. Couldn't miss it in Harbor Springs. It was a landmark. And as a younger lad, I grew up in Cross Village, but I live in Harbor Springs now. They're two very different places. I always say I'm from Cross Village, but live in Harbor. But as a kid, we'd come to Harbor. My mom would say, that's the school. That's the Indian school, the boarding school. And she'll tell me little bits and pieces about it that she knew about. So it was undeniable. Everybody knew about it. So this is a pretty rare photo that came into our collection about 10 years ago. And I've been at my job for 17 years. It's really weird to think that, I'm almost closing in on 2 decades of working in the archives for the tribe. And my mom's a tribal citizen, Peggy Hemenway, and she did her work for sure in the 80s, helping with the tribe's reaffirmation. And she's like, now it's your turn to do something. So go do it. And so she's a toughie. So I've been doing it, Mom. And we get some really great donations. And this came into our department 10 years ago. This non-native guy said my mom was a reporter for the News Review and other newspapers in the 50s, and he had all of her original photos. And she goes, she covered the tribe, she loved the tribe, but she would want these to go back. So he gave us all these photos. Really, one of our best collections. This photo really stood out immediately. I call it a rival. And these are kids from the Upper Peninsula, Ojibwe, coming to the school day of, their first day. And they're from the western end of the UP when that school closed in 53. Holy Name of Jesus, all those kids started to come down here. So we've seen a big influx of Upper Peninsula Ojibwe coming to Waganuxing. And you can see they're there for the long haul, beat up suitcases, boxes, so on and so forth. And it has a real, it's got a real powerful story to it. A little eerie to me, a little foreboding. But during this last year, the story of Indian boarding schools, it just really broke internationally. And it all started in Canada. They have the same system called residential schools, the exact same thing. And last year, they started finding these discoveries of mass burials around these residential schools. They found 180 kids around one school, 205 around another, and then they found 750 kids around one school in Canada. That's an entire generation. And it became undeniable, like this happened. But Native communities knew about this since day one, like I said, but nobody was listening. Now you have to listen. And so Canada started doing its investigation into these schools. But then right now we're having a moment for Natives here in the States because the Secretary of Interior is a Native woman, first Native in the cabinet, and Deb Haaland. And Deb Haaland said, we don't have to look at Canada. We got to look in our own borders. We have the exact same system. But Canada has 200 schools. We have over 400. So we have the work cut out for us. And they launched an investigation into Indian boarding schools. Just this past May, they issued their preliminary report of recommendations of what needs to get done, next steps. It's not an end-all be-all report by any means, but it's a step forward. It's a first step. And just this August, the Secretary of Interior and her team came to Pellston, Michigan. They were doing hearings on boarding school survivors across the country. New Mexico, South Dakota, Minnesota, Pellston, Michigan. So it was open to the public, and for sure I went. And this is huge that the Secretary of Interior, who's Native, is coming to our backyard. And it was a really, really tough day. For 7 hours, we heard testimony of survivors who went to the Holy Childhood. And they ranged from the late 50s to the 80s, ages all over. And it was a very, very sobering and really tough day to hear all these stories of the worst things you could ever imagine kids having to go through. So I always say, these stories are coming out. It's for the survivors to tell. So they're doing that as we speak. So I encourage you to listen to them. But just the stories were tough, really, really, really tough. And at the end of the 7 hours, we all kind of were numb and just kind of, I can't imagine going to the school after just hearing these stories. And one of my colleagues from the Upper Peninsula was at the hearing, and her dad went to that school, Holy Childhood. And I haven't seen her in a long time. And we caught up. She's like, you still at the tribe? I'm like, yeah. She's like, man, good for you. That's a run. And kind of catching up. And she goes, hey, I know you got this interview of my dad. And we do. There was a oral history project done a few years ago. And her dad was volunteered to be interviewed. And he's walked on since. He walked on about 4 years ago. She goes, my dad's no longer with us, but I really would like to get that interview. I'm like, for sure. But it's really tough to watch. He's got a tough story. And she goes, I know, but I have to hear it. So, yeah, I'll get it to you. I got to find it. But in the meantime, we got these photos that came in, and I'll send a few to you and see if they resonate or if you recognize or anything. So I sent her this photo, and 10 minutes later, she emailed back and said, I've been crying ever since you sent this. My dad's in that photo. It's the day he arrived. And then once she said that, I looked it over again. I'm like, yeah, that's him without a doubt. And she goes, thank you so much. Send some more, send them all. Maybe we can figure out other people. But she was like, that's the day things changed, for everybody in our family. And so you never know, the impacts or how these are going to touch people, and that this work is coming forward, and we're, moving forward slowly but cautiously in doing this. And so this is a powerful image. And so we got to respect the people who are not just in it, but their families as well. So this is 2007. School came down, and I started my job with the tribe in 2006. And the year later, the school's coming down. I was like, oh, this is a big deal. And they had one last walkthrough, and I was, green. I just started my job, and I was like, but I got to be here. And that's the only time I've really ever been in the building. And I had no, reason to go in the building before that. And so I was a fly on the wall, just listening to all these people who actually went to the school. And it was just a real learning experience for myself. And, listening to somebody who went to the school and said, they really need to tear this building down because it reminds me of all the bad things. And then I listened to somebody else and they would say, they need to keep the school up because it reminds people of the bad things so they don't forget. And they're both right, absolutely 100% right on both ends. But eventually the school, as Catholic church property, they tore it down. So to this day, you would never know if you didn't know that was an Indian boarding school that stood there. There's no sign, no marker. There's a large red brick entryway that they kept from the original school, but there's no context to it. It's just a red brick doorway. So, but at one point there was a historic marker there that said that this was an Indian school. The text was really bad, but at least it said that this was an Indian boarding school. So, being part of that last walkthrough, and then we were able to salvage some of the materials from the school, some desks, doors, things of that nature. So we have some artifacts that were there. And it became kind of a free-for-all. There was salvagers and all kinds of people just going there and taking materials. So we were able to get a few things for our archives. And this is from the Petoskey News Review covering the story. And it's a real powerful image, before and after. And even though the building's erased, it doesn't erase what happened to the people and the community, that all of these thousands of kids that went through that school, and, the loss of language, the loss of culture, the kids that were abused and treated very, very poorly, and that with the trickle effect into our families and so on and so forth, you can't erase that. So the lasting effects of there's been this loss of language, history, customs, culture. A lot of kids passed at these schools, children suffering abuses and creating traumatic cycles within our communities for generations, intergenerational trauma. And this lack of awareness that happened in Michigan has created a lot of misunderstanding and stereotypes. For example, there was a few individuals I knew growing up in northern Michigan, and I grew up with the stereotype of the drunken Indian, and now that stereotype is still there, but it's really strong when I was growing up. And then asking myself, well, how do some of these people, they do drink a lot, and what happened? And come to find out later in life, they went to this school, and who knows what happened to them, but if they weren't given the tools to fix themselves after coming out of the system, so they self-medicated with drugs and alcohol. And so that was part of these stories that just didn't get told. And then the burials of children at these schools in the United States and in Canada. That's part of one of the large focuses of this investigation from the Department of Materials. Were the kids, the ones that didn't make it home, where are they? I never want to end on a story of victimization. Just this amazing resiliency in Native communities, including here at Little Traverse. There's this revitalization in Native language, spirituality, and identity. The tribe has a language department, and they go through and they teach in public schools now, and they teach classes of Native language, Odawa, Anishinaabe, and then 50 years ago, this was not being taught. 100 years ago, certainly not being taught. We see Native parents naming their kids Odawa names. That's on their birth certificate. All of my godchildren have Odawa names. Onimkiwis, Zongade, Gimiwan, that's their name. And the kids at school speak it perfectly because that's the name they knew from day one at kindergarten. And survivors are coming forward and sharing their stories. Again, it's not my story to tell in that context. I create the historical background. And last year, you just never know what's going to happen when you pick up the phone. Sometimes I pick up the phone and sometimes I'm like, oh, do I let it go to voicemail or not? But that day I did last July. And the woman was like, hey, I know your work and I'm with NBC Nightly News. We want to do a story just on holy childhood. I'm like, this is a joke, right? This is a gag. You're not with NBC. And she sent me an email and had all the credentials. I'm like, oh, I got to talk to all 5 of my bosses because I'm going to get fired if I talk to you anymore. She goes, do what you got to do, Eric. She was in Ojibwe, actually, from Sault Ste. Marie, and she was an intern at NBC News, and she knew Michigan. That's how she called. And Megan got back to her, and I got the green light, and she goes, okay, we're coming in about a month in August. So If you could get some survivors who feel comfortable talking on camera, that would be, that would be awesome. And so I went to two people I knew pretty well and felt comfortable approaching. And before I could even finish asking, they're like, yes, we need to tell our stories. So right off the bat, we had a male and a female, had our balance. And a month later, there's NBC Nightly News setting up shop. And it was surreal. I'd seen the reporter on TV, there she was, and the producer, and they had a sound guy, and the audio or the visual guy, and the intern Megan, and they stayed for 2 full days and recorded. And it was August, it was hot. We recorded Yvonne, the survivor of the school, in front of the church for 4 hours straight. And she just told her story. And it was unbelievable. She didn't break, gave her water, kept going. And this, real warrior. And her story's tough. It's not an easy story to hear. Next day, they interviewed me. I just was historical filler, about the historical context, of course. Then we've interviewed Fred after me. He went for 4 hours. And his story is absolutely brutal, like Yvonne's. And they did it. And the team left. And then a couple weeks later, I got the text from the producers, like, this is when it's going to air on Lester Holt's show. So if you can get in front of a TV, absolutely do it. And I don't have a normal TV, I have a Roku stick thing, and so I don't have NBC. So I was like, I got to watch this live, man. This is once in a lifetime. So I went to my friend's house, his parents' house, actually, who I've graduated with their son, and I'm still good friends with them. And so I show up and I'm like, Jerry, let's watch NBC News tonight. He's like, are you drinking again? Are you sober? I'm like, yeah, I'm still sober, Jerry. And well, let's watch the news. He goes, oh, okay. And so we got our cookies and, our coffee, and then we're sitting there watching it. And it's Sunday night, and he goes, Harbor Springs, Michigan. He goes, oh my God, Eric, what's going on? And then it went right into the school. He goes, this is so good that you guys are doing this. So, viewed by 10 million people that night. And then Jerry afterwards, and he's a non-native guy. He goes, I went to that school. I go, what? You're not native? He goes, no, there was white day students. They went, not huge numbers, but we were there. I go, well, tell me about it. If you feel comfortable. And he goes, yeah, and he goes, the Indian kids always got treated rougher, for sure. And the Indian borders always got treated rougher than the other kids, for sure. He witnessed this as a non-native. And then he goes, there was these 2 boys from the Upper Peninsula. Jerry was there in the 50s. He goes, these 2 boys from the Upper Peninsula, all they did was run. They always wanted to run back home. And they were on the western end of the Upper Peninsula. Not St. Ignace, nowhere close. And they always got caught, and they always got brought back, and they get locked in the 3rd floor, and no food, no bedding or nothing. They lock them in there for a couple days. And Jerry became friends with them. And throughout the day when they were locked up there, Jerry would sneak food. He'd hide a sandwich, a banana, a cookie, whatever he could get his hands on, because he could leave at the end of the day. And when he did, he'd run out, and those 2 brothers would stick their head out the window and say, hey, Jerry, what do you got for us today? And he'd throw up that food. He was feeding them. He was taking care of them. He goes, oh, got half a bologna sandwich, old potato and a cookie. That's fine by us, Jerry. You're a pretty good guy. You're all right. And he would do this all the time. Come to find out, one of those boys was my colleague's friend who was in that photo. So it's like all these pieces are coming together about, this school, its impact. So I got to tell that story to my colleague that says, somebody was looking out for your dad. These friendships were formed. They took care of each other. And Jerry's a non-native guy. He's always been cool, but I didn't know he's real cool even way back. So, everybody was, had their story there. And back to this DOI, Department of Interior hearing, this again, really watershed moment. Deb Holland's like a rock star in Indian country. So just to sit in the room with her was pretty awe-inspiring for us as natives. But then at the end, she's one of us, a native person. And she gave some opening remarks. gave the floor to the survivors and closed with some remarks. Very gracious. I liked how that was handled. And so the story's coming out more and more. Again, I just ask people to approach it with sensitivity, be patient, and let the survivors lead this in the storytelling of this. And I just feel very, fortunate, blessed to provide this historical overview of it, to give context. And that, one of my colleagues who's a journalist, she's seeing the story breaking last year, and she goes, "Eric, get ready. It's going to be heavy." I go, "It's been heavy. I've known about this for a long time." But she goes, heavy in the sense of, being approached and other people who may not have the best intentions. And she was spot on as a journalist, that people started coming out of the woodwork and want to do these documentaries and these stories. And it was pretty gross. These people want to do a documentary, and I go to look at their body of work, and it's finding Sasquatch, alien hunters, haunted houses. I'm like, no, we're not going to put our story with that. You're being sensational. And the word that she used was trauma porn, that these people just want the trauma, and they profit off it. And that really struck a nerve. I'm like, yeah, I got a hold of her later, like, man, you were 100% right on not a ton of people, but you're still coming out of the woodwork. And we just had a guy approach me, and he wanted to do this documentary, and like, no, if it's going to be done, it's got to be done by Native people, with Native people, and with the survivors' best interests at heart, because there's hundreds of these survivors out there. This isn't from 100 years ago. This is from 83, 70, 1960, 1950. These people are still alive. So we got to be mindful of that. So with that, I want to say, miigwech, thank you for spending an evening with me. I did this talk last night. Same spot, same hoodie, same everything. So
Eric, we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And, I think we knew this wasn't going to be easy information to hear. And this was only 1 hour, not the 7 hours that you heard. We don't have a lot of time for Q&A, but there is one question. Our moderator for questions is Sue Vandeventer, and I think she has one that's come in. And there you go.
I do, yes. Thank you very much, Eric. That really was powerful, to use your own words. One of our attendees, Kate, has asked, "Thank you so much, Eric. I've heard that human remains of children were uncovered at Holy Childhood in 2007. Can you comment on that?"
Yeah, no, Kate. There's been multiple discoveries around Holy Childhood, and I was actually part of one of the recoveries in 2011, and that's a story for, I guess, in person. I don't feel comfortable doing this story online over Zoom, but I was part of one of them, and it was a very, very tough day, and I'll just leave it at that. And I got asked the same question last night, and the person didn't like my answer of not wanting to talk about it. And I was like, for me, it has to be in person. So it's an in-person conversation, but long story short, that there is people there.
And just real quick to wrap up, you mentioned working with schools and students. Is this information being taught in all our schools?
Not all our schools. I've been working with Harbor Springs Public Schools for, 12 years now. Working with their social studies and civics and US history. And I'm very proud to say that we have been teaching this in US history for the last at least 10 years. But I got good partners at the schools. They know what I do. We work together with the teachers to develop the curriculums. And when time allows, we've done field trips with the students to go actually stand on the grounds at Holy Childhood. So we're not just in the classroom looking at photos, like, this is where it happened. This is the place. So yeah, we are doing it. But it's like any relationship, we just got to keep fostering it, keep working at it. But the teachers I work with now, they're on board. We want to do this. The administration is behind it. But again, my own personal approach to this is not focusing on the trauma, focusing on the system, and that the system created this, but these systems weren't always positive for these populations. I don't think it's, again, I don't want to just completely dwell on the victimization, because that kind of story can really draw you in, and you kind of get stuck there. Like you just, oh, all these kids were abused, all these kids didn't make it out. That happened, but you got to tell the context, the bigger story as well, and not end with that. That, every time I hear a survivor talk, they say that this is healing for them, and that it didn't break us. It's this reoccurring, message to everybody out there. So I try to keep that in mind when I'm creating these lesson plans and curriculums, but I'm also working a lot with universities on doing this. But I feel very fortunate that, right in my own backyard of, Harbor Springs Public Schools, we're doing it. And I graduated from Harbor Springs in 1995. We never talked about natives in anything at all, let alone the boarding schools. And so once I got a little knowledge in my brain, I was like, I'm going to try to do what I can to change this. Because when I was a student there, you were just invisible. You weren't ever talked about as a Native person in the school, part of any type of curriculums whatsoever. We maybe talked about Natives twice. I wasn't the most stellar student, but I remember quite a bit. And I remember feeling like nobody's talking about us. And there's a visible Native population in Harbor, but that's changing. We are talking about it.
Good. Thank you so much, Eric. I think that's all we have time for.
I'm going to end the recording. And Eric, again, thank you for joining us. We just appreciate learning from you and getting a deeper understanding of the issues of our local history in the tribal community. So thanks again. We appreciate it. As a reminder, we have a quick 15-minute member meeting.